The Boston Bruins have a choking problem. As you likely know, the team was just upset by the 8th seed Florida Panthers in round 1 of the 2023 Stanley Cup playoffs. This, despite setting the record for the most wins in a season with 65 and the most points in a season with 135. And despite having a 3-1 series lead and a 3-2 lead in Game 7 on home ice with a minutes left in regulation. It's tough to properly describe just how badly they dropped the ball. The word spectacular certainly comes to mind. It's a choke of epic proportions. But for those that have paid attention, this is nothing new. This, my friends, is the norm. If you're like me, born to parents who were both diehard and still are to this day Bruins fans, aka child abuse to some of you, you grew up hearing the stories of triumphs past, but you also heard about the bad times. And if you're like me, a man in his late 20s, you've witnessed those bad times yourself over and over again. After securing 3 championships between 1929 and 1941, Bruins fans had to wait until 1970 for the club to return to their prior glory. They'd reward those fans with another championship in 1972. And hey, with Phil Esposito, Bobby Orr, Johnny Busick, Wayne Cashman, Ken Hodge, so many others, maybe the 70s were shaping up to be the Bruins' decade. Or maybe not, as they had a wonderful habit of running into very good teams from Montreal and Philadelphia. And as most of you know, this will not be the last time I get to mention those two cities when talking about the Bruins' playoff history. They also failed, in 1975, to advance past Chicago, losing in a best-of-3 by the score of 2-1. That's the 94-point Bruins falling to the 82-point Hawks. That was a 12-point gap that egregious? Maybe, maybe not. But it won't be the largest point gap that we'll talk about today. Just you wait. In the 1980s, Bruins fans saw Raymond Bourque, or Jesus as he was known as in my house growing up, trying to lead the Bruins damn near single-handedly at times back to the promised land. Shockingly, however, there was more losing to Montreal, and 4 series in particular stand out from that decade. In 1980, despite 14 more points than them in the regular season, the Bruins fell to the eventual Stanley Cup champion New York Islanders in round number 2, losing the series in 5. In 1982, they lost again in the second round, this time in 7 games, to the Quebec Nordiques, despite that same point gap, 14, from the regular season standings. And do you like the number 14? I hope you do, as the very next year in 1983, they lost in the third round to the Islanders again in 6 games, despite that 14-point gap in the regular season. Now, is it a choke to lose to the Dynasty Islanders? Maybe not, but I'm salty right now, so yes, it is. I am retroactively salty 40 years later. And in 1984, they were swept in 3 games in the first round by Montreal. Yay. Oh, and there was a 29-point gap between the two in the regular season. Boston with 104 points to Montreal's 75. Call the toilet lid daddy. The 1990s kicked off where the 80s left off with 3 crushing playoff losses. In 1990, they lost to Edmonton in the Stanley Cup Final in 5 games, with a smaller 11-point gap between the two in the standings. In 1991, they lost to Pittsburgh in the third round, despite a 12-point gap. And now you might be saying, why, that's not too bad, losing to the Oilers and the Penguins. Think of the legends, the Hall of Famers on those teams, the continued success. Well, and they were swept by Buffalo in round 1, despite a 23-point gap between them. 109 points to 86. The early 2000s saw the emergence of Joe Thornton, Sergei Samsonov, Brian Ralston, Glenn Murray, and numerous others who also couldn't avoid this curse. In 2002, the Bruins lost in the first round in 6 to Montreal. with a 13-point gap in the standings. And fast forward a little bit to the end of the decade, 2009. Jumbo Joe is gone, but in are Zdeno Chara, Mark Savard, Patrice Bergeron, and David Krejci are a bigger part of the team, and they lose in 7 to Carolina with a 19-point gap between them from the regular season standings. I hate you to this day, Scott Walker. And then the 2010s. We kick things off with an extra spicy meatball. The Bruins up 3-0 on Philadelphia in the second round, and they blow it. The Flyers force game 7, but maybe, just maybe, it'll be okay. And look at that. Look at it. The Bruins. Look at them. Up 3-0 in game 7. They lost 4-3. Somehow, the worst is still to come. But for a brief but oh so beautiful moment, it all works out. After 39 years, they've finally done it. They've brought the cup back home to Boston, defeating the Vancouver Canucks in 7 games. I attended the championship parade with family. It's a day and a time that I hope to never forget. Snap back to reality, and in 2012, the Bruins lose to Washington in round 1 in 7, thanks to some unknown at the time goaltender named Braden Holtby, who'd proceed to spank the Bruins' collective asses for nearly the next decade. But could that have been just a blip on the radar? Are the Bruins truly back? Think back to the early 70s. There was a break in between the cups, but it's happening again. They're going to win again. The Bruins are back in the Stanley Cup final, and sure, losing to the juggernaut Hawks in 6 isn't inherently a choke, but it sure as hell is when you piss away a potential game 7 in 17 seconds. And then 2014, where the Bruins, the President's Trophy winning Bruins, does that sound familiar? Lose in the second round in 7 to Montreal. Does this sound familiar? Despite a 17-point difference in the regular season standings, kill me. Pain, trauma, a rebuild on the fly. But it's all worth it. Because in 2019, the Bruins return to the Stanley Cup final to take on St. Louis, the team that Bobby Orr flew over on his way to sports immortality, and immortality. We invent new words for this man around here. How could they possibly 4-1 in game 7 on home ice? Jesus wept, and so did Brad Marchand. And thus, we've reached modern times. Patrice Bergeron is still here. Now captain of the team. David Krejci, he's still here too. Insulated by the new gen, the new core, Pasternak, McAvoy, a seemingly unbeatable goalie tandem, and surefire Vezina winner Linus Ullmark, and the future, who is also the now, Jeremy Swayman. Further bolstered by acquisition after acquisition, Bertuzzi, Saka, Hall, Orlov, Lindholm, and none of it matters. They lose to the Florida Panthers in round 1 in 7 games after a 3-1 series lead and a 3-2 lead in the game with as little as a minute remaining. A record-setting President's Trophy run ends at the hands of a team that they recorded 43 more points than in the regular season. That, my friends, is Boston Bruins hockey. Boston Bruins hockey is pain. For a brief time, the big bad Bruins returned to inflict said pain upon others. But for the vast majority of their existence, the club has only served to torture those who follow, and they're damn good at it. So what now? Well, us Bruins fans get a lifetime of memes directed our way for one of, if not the worst collapse in sports history. It's certainly up there for series-based collapses. Maybe it's a different story for one-off collapses like we've seen in Super Bowls. We potentially have to watch the face of the franchise for the last 20 years step away from the team, if not the game entirely. It's seemingly, almost certainly, going to get worse before it gets better. And people, well, they'll have no sympathy for us. Why should they? Over a dozen championships from the region's sports teams over the last 20 years. We're spoiled. It's true. But behind those triumphs is a lot of pain. But I know where I'll be this fall, right back in line, ready to suffer some more. Let's go Bruins. Primarily to the golf course because you fucking blew it, but let's go Bruins.